This week, we're going to talk about Virginia and New England. And today we're talking about Virginia, and Thursday we'll talk about New England, right? Oh, yeah. And so the video that I had you watch, The Color of Money, has to do with the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, which will begin for our history in Virginia in 1619, right? And then, so that's why we watched that movie today, and then we'll talk about it after I'm done with a hopefully short lecture. And then on Thursday, we'll talk about New England, and we'll then also discuss that King Philip's War. Do you guys remember this slide I showed you last week? And remember that we talked, this is actually, this is Henry VIII up here, very famous portrait of Henry VIII. And this is the trial of King Charles. Do you guys remember what happened to King Charles the First? It was before the English Civil War, okay? So the English Civil War lasts from 1643 to 1649. We didn't really talk about that much other than to say that he had a falling out with Parliament over raising taxes, but the real issue was who has the right to rule? Is it the king or is it Parliament, right? And so having said that, and this going along with our questions on the study guide, there are two main issues that we talked about here going up to where we get to Oliver Cromwell that are disturbing English politics. And what are those two issues?
It's religious war. There was a
Exactly.
split within the church that basically caused a reformation of religion, and
Right.
a lot of England was Protestant, or what do you call it? Anglican, I believe,
Okay.
whereas another part was Catholic.
Okay. So that's exactly right. What happens was that England was actually Catholic, and all of Europe was Catholic. That's why they call it Catholic. Catholic means universal, right? But there were wars of Reformation going on the continent of Europe over religious dogma, essentially religious doctrine. Okay, that was the war with Martin Luther and the Vatican and King Charles I and all that. Henry actually broke the English church away from the Catholic Church, but not because he disagreed with their doctrine, but because why?
They wouldn't let him divorce a woman he didn't like because he wanted to marry another one.
Exactly. So what that means then is that when we talk about the Reformation, we have to be specific about which Reformation we're talking about. Are we talking about the Reformation in Europe? Are we talking about Martin Luther's Reformation? Or are we talking about the English Reformation, which is different? It's a different animal altogether. The Reformation in Europe was over religious doctrine. The Reformation in England was over essentially politics and money, because when Henry made himself head of the church, that meant he owned all the monasteries, and so he took all the money away from all the monasteries, right? So politics and money is what drives the English Reformation, and it's different from the Reformation in Europe. You guys got what I'm saying? But at any rate, what happens is that then the question becomes, well, what is going to be the official religion of England? And they go back and forth between different forms of Protestantism and Catholicism. The solution that they came up with in the Reformation was whoever rules chooses the religion, right? So if the monarch in England is Catholic, then everybody in England has to be Catholic, right? But if the monarch in England is Protestant, then everybody in England has to be Protestant. You guys get what I'm saying? But here's the problem. Henry was Protestant, Mary was Catholic, and Elizabeth was Protestant. You guys get what I'm saying? So during these wars of the Reformation, if you were one religion and somebody else was the other religion, what was your relationship? What were you supposed to do? If I'm Catholic and you're Protestant, what am I bound to do? It's either that I can convince you to return to the Catholic Church, or then it's my obligation to kill you. Okay, you guys got that? So that's what was causing all the wars, right? Well, anyway, So that's a big issue, and it's a big issue all the way through, because as time went on, England became more and more Protestant, but the monarchs were actually Catholic. James and Charles were both Catholic, right? And that was one of the big issues that went into the English Civil War, okay? Because the basically what the Parliament had said was, we're not going to spend our money fighting against Protestants, all right? Did you guys get that? Questions, comments? Okay, so the next thing then, it has to do with, where does the right to rule come from? Before I do that, though, I want to go back one step, right? And I'm going to say that during the reign of James I, there was a group of Protestants who felt, oh, let's go all the way back. Okay, let's go all the way back to Henry, okay? All the way back during Henry, right? There was a group of Protestants who were not Anglicans, but were Calvinists, right? And Calvinists are much more Protestant than the Anglicans are. Anglicans are very similar to Catholics, all right? So, in fact, the main difference is just who's the head of the church. But the Calvinists thought that they had a direct line to the exact right church, the right religion, the right relationship with God. And so they had this idea that now that the English church had broken away from Rome, even though they weren't fully Calvinist, they could become Calvinists. So they came up with this idea that they could purify the church from within. Okay. And so those people who thought they could purify the church from within became known as
Puritans.
Puritans, exactly. Okay, so now when we get up here to James, one group of those Puritans is going to move to Holland, because they're going to say, well, we're never going to be able to purify the church from within. We're just going to leave it hanging right there. Okay, so any questions or comments about that? All right, now going back then, the other situation was, who has the right to rule? That's really what brings this civil war to a head, because Parliament says you can't raise taxes. The right to rule essentially comes from the people. And Charles says, no, the right to rule comes from God. And we talked about that last week when we talked about Locke's second treatise on civil government. What happens is there's a civil war. The king is actually captured, put on trial for treason, and beheaded. That's what this trial is here, right? And then they get rid of the monarchy, and they form what's known as a commonwealth. But the commonwealth is supposed to be like a republic, okay, with an elected leader and all that stuff, being ruled by Parliament, essentially what it was, right? But it ends up being more like a religious dictatorship, okay? So Oliver Cromwell was the leader of the army. He becomes the leader of England, the Lord Protector, and he is going to implement laws that make England not very jolly anymore. It used to be jolly old England, but now it's not very jolly anymore, because people are not allowed to drink. They're not allowed to have parties. They're not allowed to have entertainment. They have to go to church. If they don't go to church, they're fined or they're put in stocks, and they have to pay the church. And so it's this real strict religious regime, essentially, right? And the problem with that, of course, is that the English people, they're religious enough, but they're not that religious. They don't want to live under a religious regime. They don't want to give up dancing. They don't want to give up going to plays. They don't want to give up drinking and partying and things like that, right? And so what ends up happening is, after Cromwell dies, his son will briefly become Lord Protector, but then Parliament will actually ask for the return of the monarchy. The heirs of Charles actually had fled, and they were living in France. The heir to the throne, who becomes Charles II, is going to be restored to the throne. Okay, so this period of Charles II and James II is called the Restoration. Okay, the restoration of what? Mainly, it's the restoration of the monarchy, right? And so there are certain colonies in America that were formed during this time. They're called the Restoration colonies. One of them is North Carolina. One of them is South Carolina, or the Carolinas essentially, and Georgia, right? Okay, so now, what do you think in America was named after Charles?
Charleston.
Charleston, exactly. Charlestown. Okay, then the next one. Okay, so he rules. He's not very popular, but he's able to keep control of the throne for some period of time. He basically tries to ignore Parliament. He goes back to the idea that because I'm king, I was chosen by God, and I have a right to rule, and Parliament really can't put a check on my power. And that's going to cause conflict in England, but it won't cause enough conflict to oust him from the throne. But then who's going to succeed him becomes James II. And be honest with you, I don't know what the relationship, I think they're brothers, but I'm not sure. At any rate, James II will then become king. Before James becomes king, he was actually at one point the ruler of an area in America which had originally been called New England, right? So James was the Duke of York, and he became the ruler of an area in America that became that was called New Amsterdam, but was lost by the Dutch to the English, right? So what do you think in America is named after James?
New York?
He took over New Amsterdam, right? New York, all right? So New York, he becomes the ruler of New York, and one of the things that happens as ruler of New York, he tries to rule with a heavy hand. He so much so that the people who live there, who are Dutch mostly, right, eventually refuse to pay taxes, and James has to be recalled to England because the king wants the taxes. He doesn't want his brother to mess that up for him. So at any rate, or whoever this guy is, at any rate, so that shows us the idea that James has as the ruler of England, right, or as the ruler. And then when he becomes the king of England, he's not only Catholic, but he's also heavy-handed in terms of his authority. And that will cause his daughter, Mary, keep in mind it's a different Mary than this one, right? His daughter, Mary, who will be married to and team up with a guy named William of Orange. Okay, so now Orange is in Holland, it's not in Orange County, right? But William and Mary then conspire against James II, and they land an army in England in 1688. And this is what's known as the Glorious Revolution. And the result of the Glorious Revolution is that William and Mary, James actually flees. William and Mary are placed on the throne, and the Parliament is able to establish itself as the actual ruler of England. So the conflict over who gets to rule England is settled during the reign of William and Mary, where England becomes a constitutional monarchy, meaning that it's being ruled by Parliament. Questions, comments?
So it stayed a constitutional monarchy up until this day, right?
Yeah, it actually became more and more constitutional up to the point that now the king really doesn't have hardly any power, right? One of the things I don't know if you guys were paying attention over the weekend, but one of the things that people find amazing, I guess, or interesting, is that Charles, the guy who's Charles now, who was the Duke of York, but now is he was Prince of Wales, sorry. But now he's the king, King Charles III. And the question is, why did he choose Charles? Because the other two Charleses were very unpopular. But anyway, so we'll see how that plays out. Anyway, questions, comments about that? Keep in mind, it has no effect on us in America because we don't have kings. Okay, just so you know that, all right? I think you knew that already, but just to make that point clear. All right, questions, comments about any of that? Okay, so now we're up to, we have a kind of a background in English history up until the kind of the era of the Revolution, which is where we're going to go next week. All right, so just keep in mind that we want to know all this is happening in Europe so we can understand what's happening in America.